Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for watching the John Woodard Show. We have the distinct honor of interviewing Bill Federer, a nationally recognized speaker and author who's provided commentary to a variety of news organizations over the years and has written several books, is really involved in the Christian community, and has agreed to give me an interview today. We're really pleased to have him with us. Thank you very much for joining us, Bill, and your friend, my friend, Pete Benton is also on with us. Thank you so much, both of you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Bill, you're down there in the South Florida area, Southwest Florida. Tell me about your background, a thumbnail sketch for our viewers.
Right. Well, originally from St. Louis, Missouri, and I have written about 20 books, ran for Congress several times, didn't win, but came close. So I experienced my own version of election night shenanigans. I ran against Dick Gebhardt, who was the Nancy Pelosi before the Nancy Pelosi. He was the number one Democrat in Congress. And anyway, we had the top 3 members of Congress come in and campaign for me. Back then it was Dennis Hastert and J.C. Watts and Dick Armey. And we had Chuck Norris do a commercial, and Pat Boone and Ted Nugent and Art Linkletter and Zig Ziglar. And it was a big deal. Anyway, since then, I've written books on American history, world history. Recently did a new book on the history of socialism. So it's called Socialism, the Real History from Plato to the Present. And the subtitle is How the Deep State Capitalizes on Crises to Consolidate Control.
Boy, if that isn't a book for the times that we're in, I don't know what is.
Well, it does give a perspective. I tell people history is not prophetic, but it is predictive. So past behavior is the best indicator of future performance. And we have people say history repeats itself. Really, human nature repeats itself. And history is just the record of that. And the only difference is technology and military advancements. As they get, you go from, instead of Cain killing Abel with a stone, and gang leaders, you have a bronze weapon or an iron weapon or a phalanx spear or a scimitar sword or gunpowder. The weapon changes, but it's that same fallen nature. And then with technology, you can track and control more people. And so Augustus Caesar wanted to have a worldwide tracking system. It was called the census. And I guarantee if he had access to computer chips and cameras and social surveillance, he probably would have used that as well. But clearly there's a global goal in mind. And what I've found in my research on socialism is it's a cultural bait and switch. So the same way you have salesmen that might want to sell you a product promising one thing, but when you take it home, it doesn't perform. It actually fails. You call it a lemon or something, but this is like a cultural bait and switch. It promises utopia, it delivers dystopia. Promises heaven, delivers hell. Promises a dream, delivers a nightmare. And every instance that it's tried, it does that. But it keeps coming back, and each generation thinks that this time it'll work. The problem is human nature does not change.
People throughout history, every so many years, there comes along a new group of people who think that they're smarter than the previous ones who tried this and it failed on them, but we're smarter, we're going to make it happen. They fail too, and then successive generations have the ability to know what that history was and they ignore it. It's amazing to me.
Yeah, it's one of these conundrums. It's sort of in the Pied Piper of Hamelin. You know, that story in the dark ages where there's a little town in Germany and the guy with his little flute and leads the kids out. And the tradition is they were all sold into slavery. But so what I do in the book is I go back to the beginning. So the first indicators of socialism in history is Plato. And if you like, I can get into that.
Yes, sir, I would.
And John, Pete, feel free to interrupt at any time. But so Plato lived 380 BC in Athens, and he writes in passing of Atlantis, this highly structured society that sinks in the sea. But he keeps referring to it as the ideal structured society. And he considered democracy an unstructured society. And he says democracy, all right, demos means people, cracy means rule. And in a democracy, the chief characteristic is tolerance. Everybody tolerates each other. He said it's charming. It's like an embroidery patchwork with lots of colors, like a bazaar where you can buy any viewpoint. And then they tolerate people that are a little bit off. Then they tolerate people that are a lot off, till finally they're tolerating crooks and crime and fraud and broad daylight looting, and nobody does anything about it. And then it creeps into their morals. And he says, the manner of life is that of Democrats. Everyone does what is right in their own eyes. That's actually what he said. Now, he's using that term because he's describing a democracy. But he says that the young man disrespects his parents, disrespects his teachers, and then he gives into useless and unnecessary pleasures, even incest and unnatural union. Yes, that's what he's talking about, casting off of moral restraints, and it leads to domestic chaos. And then, since it's a democracy, they vote to spread the wealth around. And so now the city treasury is empty. And then they vote to take money from the rich people. Now there's no rich people. Then there's a shortage and they begin to bicker, and it turns into chaos and anarchy. And then they begin to say, can't someone come along and fix this mess? And that's when some governor comes along and says, I can fix it. I just need some emergency powers. Mm-hmm. And at first, this person is all smiles. They're the protector. But then they begin to consolidate the power till they finally stand up in the chariot of state, holding the reins of power, and they're revealed as the tyrant. So Plato explains how democracy, without the people having morals and virtue, ends in chaos, out of which some tyrant governor usurps power. And so once this tyrant is in power, he will institute a structured society. He is the head of gold, and his administrator, deep state, political crony class, they are the arms and chest of silver. They are the ruling class. And everyone else is in the ruled class. They are the abdomen of iron and bronze. They own no property, have no privacy. The government decides who gets to have children. The government takes the children away from the family, brings them into the city, indoctrinates them with noble lies. He says, we want one grand lie which will be believed by everybody. And so socialism is a structured society of a ruling class that controls all the lives of the ruled class. And anyway, so that's the beginning of it. It's basically a king on steroids. So a normal king, you know, he controls everybody's lives. He can be a despot. He can rule by whims and caprices. But this Greek king wants to indoctrinate the children, wants to bring them in and even control who gets to, you know, marry and so forth. Now, if you fast forward 2,000 years and we have Columbus discovering America, and now there are new lands, that's when the scholars in Europe began to say, hey, maybe we can set up a perfect society in these new lands. And one of them was Sir Thomas More. He wrote a book 20 years after Columbus. It's called Utopia. And the word utopia, excuse me, is a word which means nowhere. Utopia means nowhere. And it's a fictitious island off the coast of South America, supposedly discovered by Amerigo Vespucci. And it's written as a Greek dialogue of a conversation with a traveler named Hythlodaeus, which means peddler of nonsense. And so this island of Utopia is a structured society of a ruling class and a ruled class. And the ruled class, the commoners, they live in identical 3-story houses. There are no locks on any doors. There's identical clothing, free healthcare, free welfare, free food. Everyone eats in communal dining halls like a monastery. There's no ale houses, no coffee houses, no tea houses, no places for private meetings. There is no privacy. And the government tracks everybody everywhere all the time. And if you're caught without your internal passport, it's a lifetime of slavery. And there are no possessions. Everything is in a communal warehouse. And the government decides who gets to have children. And there are no marriages and families. As soon as the child can survive on its own, it's taken away and put into government indoctrination centers. And the government determines everyone's careers, that you have to work the entire rest of your life. And so this is utopia, this perfectly structured society. Now, Sir Thomas More writes it as a veiled jab at Henry VIII, who is this king that decides to switch from Catholic to Protestant. And if you don't immediately switch with him, he kills you. And so sure enough, Sir Thomas More got killed by Henry VIII. Now we fast forward another century and you're in the early 1600s. And this is Queen Elizabeth, William Shakespeare, and Sir Francis Bacon that started the scientific revolution. And Sir Francis Bacon writes New Atlantis. And this is a direct reference back to Plato's Atlantis. And it's a fictitious island in the South Pacific off the coast of Peru. And it's a structured society of a ruling class and a ruled class, a little more scientific careers because, of Francis Bacon and being the scientific revolution, but still it's all controlled. Someone wrote a satire on this. It's Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Right, so here's Gulliver washed up on this island of Lilliput, and he discovers it's a totally structured society of this ruling class that is ruling with such minutia that it's ridiculous, and then the ruled class, that their fate and their lives is all determined.
I don't think there's a single person prior to right now that ever made that connection in what was the meaning behind that book. I'm astounded.
Yeah, it's interesting. And now, why is all this important? The Pilgrims. So the early 1600s, the Pilgrims come to America, and they are originally a company colony with bylaws written by the rich investors that lent them the money for their boat ride. And the bylaws say what? Everything's owned in common. Everything gained by cooking, hunting, fishing, trading shall go into ye common stock. And everyone's livelihood comes out of ye common stock. And they tried it, and they almost starved to death. William Bradford says the young men objected to doing twice as much work as the old guy, but they got paid the same. The old guy objected to being classed in labor with the younger and considered it a dishonor. And the women objected to having to wash other men's clothes. And no one wanted to go out and plant. And
human jealousy is one of the downfall of almost all governmental societies, including the one that you're just talking about now. It's astounding.
Yeah, it's this observation of human nature. And so William Bradford says that this experiment, he called it with a communistic plan of communal living, failed, proving the emptiness of the theory of Plato, applauded recently by scholars in Europe. So in other words, the Pilgrims knew that they were actually trying to live out this theoretical Plato's and Sir Thomas More's utopia and, Sir Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. They knew they were trying to live out this, and he says that the owning of possessions in common would somehow make men happy, as if they were wiser than God. For in this instance, communal ownership of property was found to breed much confusion and discontent. And he says, in order that they would not suffer want, like another winter of starvation, He said we had to come up with a fitter plan. And after much discussion, it was decided that every man would plant corn for his own household. Wow, what a novel idea.
Yeah, yeah.
And he says this made all hands more industrious. The women now went willingly into the field to plant corn and took their little ones with them, where before they would allege weakness and to have forced them would have been great oppression. And so here we have Plato, Sir Thomas More, Sir Francis Bacon, all theoretical. Hey, okay, we'll own everything in common and everybody will take what they need and it'll be perfect. They tried it. Nobody wanted to do anything. They almost starved to death. They scrapped it. They gave everybody their own plot of land and says, whatever you plant grows is yours. And it's like, oh, everybody suddenly got really industrious. And
amazing, isn't it?
You know what that reminds me? I'm sorry to cut you off. Remember years ago, I grew up in Craven County in Havelock, North Carolina, near Morehead City here. And I remember when I was on active duty in the Air Force, some guys tried to sell me a timeshare, and it fits your model perfectly.
Absolutely.
A timeshare is shared ownership, okay? And my sister's in a timeshare and her husband, they're trying to get out of it. Essentially what it is, you pay into a timeshare and you have access to all of these places all around the world. But what's interesting, it's a lifetime contract. You can never break it. You pay maintenance fees and all that kind of stuff and everything. But I found interesting when I started to look into it, I talked to other people and they said, well, here's the other side of the coin. You don't get that timeshare when you want it. You get it when they give it to you, if it's available.
Yeah, I've got friends that have them. You ever heard of timeshare? Get out of your timeshare. They're advertising it on TV all the time.
Absolutely.
They've made a cottage industry out of the lawyers that are helping people get out of their timeshares exactly for the reasons that Bill's just talking about.
Yeah, the community model doesn't work because the thing of it is no one takes pride in the ownership. When you own something outright, you're going to take in pride in taking care of it.
And that's so important, and it's obvious to us, but the socialist appeal is always there. And again, it's like a bait and switch. It's like a fly-by-night salesman, only for a culture. Now, the next installment in the progression of the experiments with socialism is France. So we have the American Revolution, and France helped us. And you know what they got in return for helping us? Nothing but debt, and lots of it. And then a couple of years, their crops failed, and they blamed it on the king, King Louis XVI, and his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette. Everyone knows when they went to the Queen, the story is that they said the people don't have bread, and she said, let them eat cake, right? Wasn't her fault. She just grew up in court. But nevertheless, the people blamed the monarchs, and they thought, if we can just chop off the king and queen's heads, all of our problems will be solved. Well, they do, and it doesn't get any better. Then they decide to chop off the heads of all the royalty. Doesn't get any better. Then they chop off the heads of all the wealthy. You have money, we don't. You're selfish. Doesn't get any better. Then they chop off the heads of the business owners and farmers. You got food and supplies, we don't. You're selfish. Doesn't get any better. Then they chop off the heads of the hoarders, the people that have extra food stored up. We don't have enough and you have extra, you're selfish. Doesn't get any better. Then they chop off the heads of the clergy, the ones who are preaching against the head chopping off stuff. And they killed whole orders of nuns, and these nuns would be singing their church songs, would one by one be getting their heads chopped off. It doesn't get any better. Then they chop off the heads of the former revolutionaries, the ones that used to chop off heads but got tired of it. Somehow they're to blame. They do this purge. About 30,000 people had their heads chopped off in Paris, France. And if that wasn't bad enough, they sent their secular army to a rural area called the Vendée. And they killed 300,000 men, women, and children, considered the first modern genocide. So the motto of the French Revolution was liberty, equality, fraternity. Now, fraternity was their word for socialism. It's the collective, the group, the society, the socialist state. And equality can be understood two ways. In America, equality was equal opportunity and equal treatment before the law. In France, it was everyone having an equal amount of stuff. And if the fraternity, the group thinks you have too much stuff, it can take away your stuff and kill you.
Yes.
And so this is this model that took place in France, and they intentionally wanted to separate from the Christian past. Why? Well, the progression that I lay out in my book, and again, the title of the book is History of Socialism from Plato to the Present. Pilgrims, they had a covenant form of government. What's a covenant? It's like a triangle. So you have people in agreement with each other, but more than an agreement, it's people committed to caring for each other. It's the body of Christ. It's this covenant. Why do you care for each other? Well, because everybody is individually accountable to this God, and that you have a personal relationship with. And you get rights directly from this God, not from a king. So this covenant model in the early 1600s, in the next century, covenant turned into social contract with the Age of Enlightenment and a distant God. And so this was after the scientific revolution, and you have Sir Francis Bacon, you have Sir Isaac Newton discovering laws of gravity, laws of planetary motion, Kepler, Robert Boyle discovering laws of pressure. And so some theologian says, well, maybe God made everything with laws. And like a guy who winds up a clock and sets it on its shelf, everything's just following these gears. And if God is there, he's distant. He's impersonal. He's not involved. And don't even bother praying because he's not going to intervene. And so we go from the Pilgrims, which is this covenant form of government with a personal God, to the Age of Enlightenment. Covenant turned into social contract with a distant God. In the next century, it turns into the French Revolution, which is social contract with no God. And the next century, it turned into Marxism and socialism, where the state is God. And so every socialist experiment wants to get rid of God. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's considered the father of the French Revolution, he writes in The Social Contract, he says, if the state says to an individual, it is expedient for the state that you should die, that individual ought to die, because his life is a gift made conditionally by the state. Right? So if there's no God, then you don't have any rights from a creator. You just have rights that the government gives you. And there's a quote from Eisenhower. He said, in some lands, the state claims to be the source of human rights. If the state gives rights, it can and inevitably will take away those rights. So we have the French Revolution. Democracy without morals and virtue ends in chaos, and there's 30,000 people and 300,000 of that Vendigue all getting killed. And out of that chaos, you get a governor that usurps power. In this case, his name is Napoleon. And then Napoleon conquers across Europe, killing about 6 million people died in the Napoleonic Wars. Afterwards, you have the King of Prussia saying, we can't get conquered that easily again. We need to strengthen our state. And so he needs a philosopher, and he got Hegel, Hegel, who taught at the University of Berlin. And Hegel said, the state is God walking on earth. The state is our mortal God. All the worth that a human being has, he has only through the state. We must worship the state. The state does not submit to any arbitrary rules of good and bad. And you think, what's he talking about? Arbitrary rules of good and bad? The 10 Commandments, right? There's no morals. It is just a power grab by the state. There's no God. And if you help the state to grab more power, the state thinks your life is worth something. If you do not help the state grab more power, or if you challenge the state's power, the state can use its state power to go after you and kill you. And so we go from Pilgrim Covenant with a personal God, Age of Enlightenment, which is a social contract with a distant God, French Revolution, social contract with no God, to Marxism, socialism, where the state is God. And so anyway, so here we have Hegel. he comes up with a way for the state to concentrate power. He calls it Hegelian Dialectics or Hegelian Dialectics. And it's a triangle.
I've heard of that and had no, but I was way too young to understand its meaning, but now I'm getting it.
So Hegel says that it's a triangle with one corner being a thesis, the opposite corner being an antithesis, and the top corner being a synthesis. It sounds complicated, but it's not. In other words, you start off with the status quo, you create a problem that's real bad, and then everybody settles for your answer that's half as bad. And then that synthesis becomes the new starting point, and you create another problem that's real bad, and everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. That becomes the new starting point. You create another problem that's real bad, everybody settles for your answer that's half as bad. After each problem, people give up a little bit more of their freedoms to have problem solved. So just like you have democracy without morals and virtue turns into chaos, out of which a tyrant arises, this sort of speeds it along by saying, let's create the chaos that will cause people to be insecure and panic and be willing to give up their rights to a government who usurps and concentrates power.
Sounds like our friend up in Chicago talking, who said, "Don't let a good crisis go to waste."
Yeah, Rahm Emanuel. And
yes.
So you and I go through a crisis. Our response is, how can we help people through it? They see a crisis, they go, this is an opportunity for us to usurp power and concentrate it into the hands of the state that always ends up being run by a political party called the deep state. It's the cronies, the royalty class, and they always end up being the most crooked of them that ends up being the head of it, who's the tyrant, the Stalin, the Pol Pot, the Ho Chi Minh, the Castro, the Mao Zedong. And so this model sent a student underneath of Hegel at the University of Berlin was Karl Marx. And so Karl Marx said, gee, how do you create an antithesis? And he said, you send in agitators, agent provocateurs, community organizers, labor organizers. Their job is to identify groups with grievances, organize them, stir them up to riot. And when the country panics enough, then you have an excuse for some tyrant, philosopher, king, dictator, Napoleon to come in and usurp power and take away all their freedoms. This was done, maybe not in a equation type of method, but nevertheless, it was done by the British. This is how they took over India. So around 1714, the British land in Bengal and open a trading post, and then it turns into a fort, and then where they have guns, and then they would give guns to one neighboring kingdom and then give guns to another neighboring kingdom, and then stir up ancient animosities between the two until it broke out into war. They would kill each other, beat each other up, and when they were totally depleted, the British would come in to restore order, and they would take control of both. And then they would do this again with another kingdom and another, until finally the British took over all of India, a quarter of the world's population, and disarmed everybody. So only the British had guns. And they tried doing it during the American Revolution by inciting the natives on the frontiers to butcher the inhabitants of these settlements, right? It's even mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. And then, of course, during the War of 1812 and Fort Mims, Alabama, 500 butchered. And even the historical marker says the Indians, the Creek Indians, were supplied with arms by the British at Pensacola. So here you have the British stirring up a group inside of a country to bring this crisis so that they can take advantage of it and usurp power. And so we have inklings of this coming to America. One notable instance is Eugene Debs, D-E-B-S, and we have the 1890s, the Pullman Railroad Car Company. There is a decline in orders for railroad cars, and so their nice little community where they had a factory south of Chicago, they had built neighborhoods for the workers to live in, and they built stores for the workers to shop in so that they wouldn't have to waste time traveling and maybe spend a little more time with their families. It was a perfect little area, but when the orders for railroad cars dropped off, the workers were not being able to work and pay their bills. And so there was a lot of disgruntled people. And so Eugene Debs comes over and organizes them to strike and riot and destroy $80 million worth of railroad cars in 27 states. It brings the country to a standstill. The railroads aren't moving. Finally, the president, Grover Cleveland, has to send in the U.S. Army to stop this strike. And so Eugene Debs then started the Socialist Party of America. And he ran for president 5 times between 1900 and 1920. One time he ran for president from prison. And then in 1920, branching off of the Socialist Party of America is the Communist Party USA. And Thomas Norman, and they run candidates for president every year from 1920 to 1940. But in 1940 is when Franklin Roosevelt made a treaty with Stalin during World War II. Stalin is the head of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And so the Communist Party USA said, why should we run another candidate when all we need to do is just support the Democrats? So from 1940 on, the Communist Party USA has supported the Democrat Party. And now if you want, I can take a couple more steps. I don't know how we're doing time-wise.
Well, Ken's got a commitment at 11 o'clock and it's 10:40. So we have probably about another 5 or 10 minutes. So please continue.
So we have Germany, 1920s. It's a republic, the Weimar Republic, and they're climbing out of post-war situation, and someone starts a political party. It's called the National Socialist Workers' Party, and the head of it is Adolf Hitler. And he has a violent branch to his party, sort of a KKK type, sort of an Antifa BLM. They're called brown shirts. And they're nicknamed stormtroopers, Sturmabteilung, because they would storm into the meetings of Hitler's opponents and shout down the speakers and disrupt the meeting. And then they would lock arms and block access to buildings and block streets. Could you imagine people locking arms and blocking streets? And then they went into the cities and smashed windows and looted and set on fire over 7,000 Jewish stores in the night of broken glass, Kristallnacht. And in this panic and confusion created by the National Socialist Workers' Party violent arm, the country's in panic. And the chancellor, Adolf Hitler, seizes power and makes himself a Fuhrer and rounds up his political enemies and has them shot without a trial. The dust settles. The country has transitioned from a republic to a dictatorship. So this idea of creating the crises with these agitators. And then after World War II, Germany, France, and England gave independence to their former colonies. And they start brand new countries with brand new leaders. They're climbing out of the post-war crises. And the Soviet Union decides that it doesn't just want communism running the Soviet Union, it wants it running the world. So they would send KGB agents into these brand new countries, Romania, Poland, Lithuania, Hungary, and they would identify groups with grievances, ethnically, Croats, Serbs, Bosnians, religiously, Sunni, Shia, Orthodox, racially, the different economic differences. It really didn't matter. They were just wanting to identify groups and break them into victims and oppressors, haves and have-nots. And they would organize the have-nots to have protests, that they would escalate into riots and then escalate into violence and then smash windows and set things on fire. And then they would co-opt the media with bribes and threats to blame the leader of the country for all the problems.
Sounds and they would exactly what we've just been facing.
And then they would nurture weak links in the military, find people that aren't really loyal to the leader. And then when the country got panicky and confused enough, they would do a coup or a rigged election and replace the leader with a Soviet puppet. they would even have the media release false polling data ahead of a rigged election so that when they did their coup, nobody would challenge it. And now country after country was falling, and Truman is the president. He does nothing. He thinks the United Nations that he helped form would bring world peace. But the next president is Eisenhower, and he's faced in 1950 with Iran siding with the Soviet Union. And you think, well, what's the big deal? Well, Britain has no oil fields in Britain. And so in 1908, they formed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. You know, the Middle East, you got Lawrence of Arabia, the British are over there. And so the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, you know better as BP. British Petroleum is really the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And so when Iran sides with the Soviet Union and nationalizes their oil industry, Britain is having an oil shortage. So they appeal, they have a worldwide navy, they need oil. So they appeal to Eisenhower, and Eisenhower approves the first CIA operation to overthrow a country's leader. It's called Operation Ajax. And Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, is the CIA operative on the ground. He's an expert in foreign languages. He goes over to Tehran and he recruits mobsters and gangsters and radical imams. And they stage protests and riots and attack mosques. And then they co-opt the media with bribes and threats to blame the leader of the country, Mossadegh, for all the problems. And they nurture weak links in the military. And when the country gets panicky and confused enough, they march in. They put Mossadegh under house arrest. They lock him away for the rest of his life where he dies, and they install the Shah. And the Shah loved America because we put him in. And the CIA did the same thing in Guatemala in 1954, the Congo in 1960, Dominican Republic, even Chile 1973, and the KGB did the same thing, with Brezhnev helping Yasser Arafat to start the PLO, and Brezhnev hugging Castro and helping him take over Cuba, and the Russians and taking over countries in Latin South America and staging over 100 coups in Africa, and then the Chinese doing the same thing in the Far East. This is called the Cold War. Sort of the subject of every spy novel, right? You go to a third world country, you run into the KGB, the Russians, you run into the CIA, and they're all going to do an assassination. The only difference this time around is it seems like it's taking place on our own soil.
Yes, it did.
And we know there's people in the deep state government positions that do not like our current president. And they've been using their positions for years to do a false Russian collusion narrative, a false Ukrainian extortion narrative. Now we're beginning to see it just take another deeper level, and using tactics that our CIA has used for going on 70 years to keep foreign countries from turning communist. But now they're being used in our political system. So the previous president, he co-opted the IRS and had Lois Lerner come into his office a record 147 times. And Lois Lerner used the IRS to go after conservatives. And when she was called in to testify before Congress, she simply pleaded the Fifth Amendment, stood up, and walked out. And then we have the Department of Justice was co-opted with Eric Holder, Fast and Furious, giving guns to drug gangs in Mexico. And then we see other departments being co-opted. And even the LGBT transgender agenda, one of the fallouts was it was used as a hammer to drive officers with traditional values out of the military. So all that was left was people that would carry out the agenda. And so
Obama
we see
got rid of over 100 flag officers and put his stooges into those positions for this very reason that you're talking about now.
Hey, John, it's closer to 400.
Oh, really?
I served, and I vividly recall what Bill's saying is exactly true. I was a senior officer in the Air Force. We were told point blank that if we made any public comments be it on the computer or anything defamatory, derogatory towards the president, we would be fired and lose our commissions. And I know for a fact, having had senior officers that I worked with in Washington under the Reagans and the Bushes, he fired more senior officers than any other president in the history of the country.
Wow.
Go ahead, Bill. We're running out of time. Let's try to. I'd like to keep on going, but Ken's got a commitment away from the house. So let's try to get a little closer.
Well, it's all in the book, Socialism: The Real History from Plato to the Present. One of the anecdotal stories is I lived in St. Louis, just 30 minutes from Ferguson, Missouri. And 99% of the people rioting in Ferguson were not from Ferguson. They were brought in by They were brought in by MORE, M-O-R-E, Missourians Organizing for Reform and Empowerment. And MORE got $33 million from George Soros. And you can Google it. And then they had training on how to lock arms and block Highway 44 and Highway 70. And they would train them how to give emotional, tear-filled addresses when the camera was shoved in their face, and tell them that your audience is not the person in front of you, it's the country. And then they rioted. And afterwards, they weren't paid. They were promised thousands of dollars apiece, and they weren't paid. So they took over the MORE headquarter office, and they started a hashtag cut the check campaign. And it got local attention with the city council in St. Louis condemning their actions. And then they hurried up and cut the check and paid them before it went national. But this was a rent-a-mob. And the same group of people, they moved to Milwaukee and Charlotte and Baltimore. And so here you see these riotings that we had earlier this year with Antifa and BLM. And lo and behold, you'd have pallets of bricks that were dropped off right where they were going to have a peaceful protest. I spoke in Emporia, Kansas. A former state rep organized the meeting, and they said, yeah, somebody dropped off a pallet of bricks, and there was no construction going on in that area, but it happened to be right where they were going to plan a peaceful protest. Yeah. This is a highly organized movement. And so anyway, I just, thought I'd give a little encouragement to everyone and so forth. But the book, Socialism: The Real History from Plato to the Present, it gives you the historical background of the idea of creating or capitalizing on a crisis to consolidate control. And there's more to it, but AmericanMinute.com is my website, AmericanMinute.com.
I wish that I wish we had more time. Before we got started, Ken asked me how long he thought it was going to take, and I gave him a thumbnail sketch of how long I thought the meeting was going to take, and I had no idea that it was going to be so intriguing. But you have provided a lot of information, and I am quite sure that your book sales are going to go up when this gets out. So we're I'd like to think that that when in a little bit of time that I can get back with Pete, maybe we can have another session like this where we can go into where we are with not only the progression of socialism up to the current day, but how it manifests itself in the election of our political leaders and the news media, some of which you have already touched on. But if there's anything more that you can add to that, I'd certainly like to hear it.
Yeah, I'd be thrilled to be back on. I talk about the church's role and how it's socialism is not what the early church practiced. They sold their land, brought it to the feet of the apostles, not to the feet of Pilate. I go through the whole concept that in the Bible that if you own private property, you can be charitable with it. Where Karl Marx says communism can be summed up with the abolition of private property. And then there's several chapters on manipulating public opinion. Joseph Goebbels in Germany, the minister of propaganda for Hitler, and how this studying of how people want to fit in with a group has been utilized for marketing of products, but now marketing of political ideas, but then controlling the information that the people get. And now it's online where you want to be liked and you don't want to be unfriended. And so they build this narrative, but it's whole chapters on that. So I think, if you'd like to have me back on, I'd be happy to.
I have the same, a lot of people share the views that I have, that with the election of Joe Biden, that the country as we have known it, grown up in it, and those of us who have fought for the country, and in both domestically and overseas, that we are looking at the possible transition of the United States in a way that that we may never recover from, and what we're talking about today is a vital part of the understanding. People, the average person doesn't know, doesn't connect the dots, and I've been putting this podcast on in order to try and connect dots for people, so that they will understand what's facing them in the very near future. So I can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming on and doing this interview with me today, and I really I can't tell you how impressed I am with everything that you have put together, and with you personally. Pete has spoken of you to me repeatedly, and the mere fact that you were willing to spend your time to come on here and help me get information out to the public, and understand the chronological events that have occurred over time to lead us to where we are. I just can't tell you how much I appreciate you doing that.
Well, John, Pete, it's an honor to be on with you, and I'm just a phone call, text, email away if you want me back on again.
Thank you very, very much. It is very kind of you, and I look forward to talking with you again. And I'm gonna get that book, and I'm gonna promote the hell out of it with everybody on my podcast, and share it. We had a lot of likes, even more shares, and so I'm gonna do that. People need if they read it, they'll understand. They'll see in those words things that are in the news every day that they have, where they couldn't understand how things connected. Now they'll know.
Amen. Well, AmericanMinute.com is the website, and again, the book is Socialism: The Real History from Plato to the Present. And the subtitle is How the Deep State Capitalizes on Crises to Consolidate Control.
Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you, John.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you don't get that book and read it, then you're missing out, because this man is a wealth of knowledge. I'm really glad to have had you with us today. Thank you so much, Bill Federer.
Thank you. God bless.